Her father sold her on a Tuesday, not with chains, not with papers signed before a judge. He sold her the way men on the frontier always sold their daughters, with a handshake over a whiskey glass, in the back of a trading post while she was hanging laundry 300 yards away, completely unaware that her entire future was being bartered for a winter's worth of debt relief and a promise that someone else would feed her through the cold months ahead. Eleanor Hayes found out the way she found out most things in her life. Too late, and from the wrong person. "Your father's made arrangements," said Mrs. Colton, the blacksmith's wife, not even looking up from the bread she was kneading. "You'll be going up to Hale's cabin before the first snow. Thought you knew." Eleanor's hands went still on the washboard. She didn't say a word. She just stood there in the gray October light, water dripping from her fingers into the dirt, while the woman who delivered this verdict went on kneading her bread like she'd announced nothing more dramatic than a change in the weather. If you've ever had someone make a decision about your life without asking you, if you've ever stood in a moment so quiet it roared, then you already know exactly what Eleanor felt in that second. And if you want to know what she did next, stay with me, because this story is about to show you something you don't expect. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Eleanor, because her story is just getting started. Eleanor Hayes had been carrying her family since she was 14 years old. That was the year her mother died of a fever that swept through their valley settlement like something deliberate, something with a grudge. 3 families lost someone. The Hayes family lost the person who held everything together. And when Margaret Hayes was lowered into the frozen ground in November, the weight of everything she'd carried quietly transferred itself onto her eldest daughter's shoulders without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without anyone ever asking if Eleanor was strong enough to hold it. She was 14. She wasn't strong enough, but she did it anyway. By the time she was 22, Eleanor could butcher a deer, stretch a hide, preserve enough food to carry 2 people through 4 months of hard winter, sew functional clothing from rough fabric, and calculate exactly how far a bag of cornmeal would stretch when split between 3 meals a day. She could do all of this, and she could do it without complaint, because complaint had never once changed a single thing about her circumstances. What she could not do, what she had never been able to do, was make her father see her as anything other than a problem he hadn't yet solved. Thomas Hayes was not a cruel man. She needed people to understand that, even when she wanted to hate him. He wasn't a man who raised his hand or his voice without reason. He didn't drink away his earnings or gamble what little they had against odds that were never in his favor. He worked hard, he meant well, and he loved his daughter in the particular way that some fathers love their daughters, from a distance, through a window, as something fragile and confusing that he was never quite sure how to approach. But Thomas Hayes was also a man who had made a series of decisions over the past 3 years that had slowly, quietly, inexorably dismantled every safety margin their small household had. A bad investment in a trading venture that never materialized. A loan taken at interest rates that compounded faster than his earnings could chase. 2 winters that had been harder than expected, eating through reserves he'd counted on surviving intact. And now, in the October of Eleanor's 23rd year, the debt had reached the point where it was no longer manageable by any means available to him. Except one. She understood this later. Not when she first heard the news. When she first heard it, the only thing she understood was the particular sensation of the ground dropping out from beneath her feet while she was expected to keep standing. But later, after the initial shock had burned itself down to something colder and more manageable, she assembled the pieces. Her father had borrowed money from Eli Marsh, who owned the trading post and 3 other properties in the valley, and who had a way of making loans that were impossible to repay because that was the entire point. Marsh didn't want money back. He wanted leverage. He wanted obligations. He collected people the way other men collected land, and Thomas Hayes, with his quiet pride and his desperate circumstances, had walked right into it. Rowan Hale had paid the debt. That was the part that didn't make sense to Eleanor when she first heard it. Rowan Hale, who lived alone up on the north end of the valley in a cabin he'd built himself 3 years prior, who came into the settlement for supplies, maybe twice a month, and spoke to almost no one when he did, who was regarded by most of the valley's residents with a mixture of respect and wariness that people reserve for things they don't entirely understand. That man had walked into the trading post and paid off Thomas Hayes's debt in full, in exchange for the promise that Thomas's daughter would come to his cabin before winter sealed the mountain pass. Eleanor stood in the yard for a long time after Mrs. Colton went back inside. The wet clothes were still in the basin beside her, unfinished, dripping. The October sky pressed down low and gray. Somewhere in the settlement a dog was barking at nothing. She thought about what her choices were. She thought about them for a long time, turning them over the way you turn over an object in your hands when you're hoping to find a surface you didn't see before. She could refuse. She had that right, technically, in the sense that no one was going to physically carry her up to that cabin against her will, but refusing meant her father's debt returned, and Eli Marsh's patience did not. She had heard what happened to the Brower family 2 years back, when Jonas Brower had tried to renegotiate terms with Marsh. She did not need the details repeated to understand the lesson. She could run. She had thought about running before, in the abstract way that people think about things they know they won't actually do. The nearest town large enough to disappear into was 4 days' ride through terrain that was about to become genuinely hostile as winter closed in. She had no horse of her own, less than $1.50 to her name, and no one waiting for her on the other side. Or she could go. She could go to Rowan Hale's cabin with her head up and her eyes open, and she could refuse to be destroyed by it. That was the choice she made. Not because it was a good choice, it wasn't, but because it was the least impossible of 3 impossible options, and Eleanor Hayes had spent her entire life making the least impossible choice and finding a way to survive it. She went inside and told her father she knew. Thomas Hayes was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked up when she came in, and she saw something in his face that she recognized, the expression he got when he'd done something he couldn't undo and was waiting for the consequences. It was the same face he'd made when he told her about the trading venture 2 years ago, the same face he'd made when he'd confessed the loan to her last spring. "Eleanor," he started. "I'm not going to make you explain it," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was proud of that, in the specific way that you can feel pride and devastation simultaneously when they're sitting right next to each other. "I understand why you did it. I need you to understand something in return." He waited. "I'm going up to that cabin," she said. "I will do what I have to do to make this work. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that this was the last time. This is the last decision you make for me without asking. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Thomas Hayes looked at his daughter, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years, and she saw his eyes go glassy before he looked down at his cold coffee. "Yes," he said. Came out rough, like it cost him something. "Good," Eleanor said. She turned and walked back to the yard to finish hanging the laundry. She left 4 days later. She had expected more time, but a storm system was building to the northwest, and old Miller, who'd been reading weather in this valley for 40 years, said the first real snow would come within the week. If she was going to get to the cabin before the pass became impassable, she needed to go. She packed what she owned into 2 bags. It wasn't difficult. What Eleanor Hayes owned after 22 years of working her family's household fit into 2 canvas bags without being forced. A second dress. 2 wool skirts. Her mother's quilt, which she would not have left behind under any circumstances short of fire. A small collection of practical things, thread and needles, a bone-handled knife, a tin of dried herbs she'd gathered through the summer. A book of poetry that had been her mother's, which she'd read so many times the spine was held together with a strip of leather she'd tied around it herself. Her father drove her up the valley road in the wagon. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, or that couldn't be communicated by the particular quality of silence between 2 people who love each other imperfectly and know it. When they came around the last curve before the Hale property, Eleanor got her first proper look at the cabin. It was not what she'd imagined, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd imagined. Something meaner, maybe. Something that matched the rumors she'd heard. The ones that said Rowan Hale had come from somewhere else under circumstances no one was quite sure of, that he'd been in some kind of trouble before he arrived here, That his silence was the silence of a man hiding something, rather than the silence of a man who simply didn't see the point in unnecessary talking. The cabin was solid. That was the first word that came to her mind. Not beautiful, not welcoming, but solid in the way that things built with care and intention are solid. Like it had been constructed by someone who understood that what you build has to last, because you'll be depending on it when conditions are at their worst. The logs were fitted close. The roof was sound. A woodpile stacked against the north wall reached nearly to the eaves and was covered with oilcloth against the coming snow. Whoever Rowan Hale was, he prepared. He was standing at the corner of the cabin when they pulled up, like he'd heard the wagon coming and had come out to meet it without quite committing to the gesture of walking all the way to the road. He was taller than Eleanor had expected. She'd seen him in the settlement, but always at a distance, and broader through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that people develop when they spend most of their time doing things that require actual physical effort. He was maybe 30, maybe a few years older. It was hard to tell with a man whose face had been weathered by outdoor living into an expression that could have meant anything. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Thomas Hayes with an expression that Eleanor couldn't fully read, but that made her father look away. Then he walked over and reached up to take her bags without being asked. "I'll get those," Eleanor said immediately, the reflex of a woman who'd spent her whole life not accepting help she hadn't requested. Rowan Hale stopped. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, but direct, like he was actually seeing her rather than a category he'd already sorted her into. "All right," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, quieter. He stepped back and let her climb down from the wagon herself, and he didn't reach for her arm or comment on the mud she stepped in at the edge of the road, or do any of the dozen small, condescending things that men in her experience tended to do when they thought they were being helpful. He just stepped back and let her manage. Eleanor picked up her own bags. Thomas Hayes climbed down from the wagon and extended his hand to Rowan. The two men shook. Her father said something low that she didn't catch, and Rowan nodded. And then Thomas was climbing back up and turning the wagon around, and Eleanor realized with a sudden lurch that this was the moment, the actual moment of departure. No more preparation possible, no more options to reconsider. She didn't run after the wagon. She'd told herself she wouldn't, and she didn't. But she stood there in the mud with her two bags and watched the wagon go until it rounded the curve and disappeared, and she allowed herself exactly one moment of something that was adjacent to panic before she breathed it down and turned to face the man who was apparently her husband now. "I don't know what my father told you about me," she said, "but I'll tell you what I told him. I'm here because I didn't have a better choice. That doesn't mean I don't have standards. That doesn't mean I'll be treated like I don't." Rowan Hale looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted, some small adjustment she couldn't quite name. "That's fair," he said. "I'd like to know which room I'll be sleeping in." "The bedroom," he said. "I'll take the main room." Eleanor studied his face, looking for the angle, the condition attached. There wasn't one that she could find. "All right," she said finally, using the same words he'd used in the same tone. She walked past him toward the cabin door. Her boots made wet sounds in the mud. Behind her, she heard him fall into step a few paces back. Not too close, not hovering, just following in the way that someone follows when they live in the same place and are headed to the same door. She reached for the handle. Inside, a fire was already burning. The room smelled like pine and wood smoke and something that had been cooking. A pot of something on the iron stove that she'd find out later was venison stew that he'd started that morning, though he never mentioned it. She set her bags down on the floor. She was here. She had survived the arrival. Whatever came next, she was already in it, and there was nothing left to do but find out what it was. She crossed to the window and looked out at the valley below, the settlement's rooftops barely visible through the trees, her father's wagon long gone, the sky to the northwest showing the particular dark edge that meant Miller's weather prediction was going to be right. The first snow would come soon. Eleanor Hayes straightened her back, the way she always had, not because she felt strong, but because falling apart was a luxury she had never once been able to afford. Whatever Rowan Hale was, she was going to figure it out. Whatever this was going to become, she was going to navigate it. She had not survived everything she'd already survived in order to be undone by a quiet man and a long winter. Not yet, Not without a fight. The venison stew was good. Eleanor didn't want to admit that, even to herself, but it was. She'd eaten half a bowl standing at the stove before she'd caught herself doing it, and moved to the table like a person with dignity. The seasoning was simple: salt, a few dried herbs she didn't recognize, something that might have been juniper berry. But the meat had been cooked low and long until it fell apart without being asked. And after 4 days of barely eating because her stomach had been too knotted with dread to accept food, her body received it like an apology. Rowan sat across the table and ate without comment. He didn't watch her eat, which she appreciated more than she expected to. He looked at his bowl, or occasionally at the fire, and when he finished, he got up and set his dishes in the basin by the dry sink without making a production of it. "Water's in the barrel by the door," he said. "I'll haul more in the morning." "I can haul water," Eleanor said. He paused, his back still to her. "I know you can." He said it without any particular emphasis, like it was simply a fact he'd already registered and filed away, and something about that matter-of-fact acknowledgement landed differently than she'd expected. She was braced for a fight she didn't get, and the absence of it left her slightly off balance in a way she couldn't immediately account for. She washed her own dish. He'd already gone to the far corner of the main room by then, unrolling a thick bedroll beside the stove with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd slept on floors before and had no particular feelings about it. "You don't have to sleep on the floor, Isk," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "I'm fine here," he said. He wasn't curt about it, just clear. She stood there for a moment, holding her wet dish, not sure what to do with the sentence she'd already started. "All right," she said finally, the second time she'd used those words today, and she went to the bedroom and shut the door. The room was small, a rope bed with a decent mattress stuffed with what felt like pine needles and dried grass, a wool blanket that had been washed recently enough that it still smelled faintly of lye soap, a single window facing east, a wooden peg on the wall for hanging clothes. That was it. No vanity, no mirror, no concessions to the idea that the person sleeping here might have preferences. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling around her, the fire, the wind starting to move outside, the distant sound of Rowan turning once on his bedroll before going still. She thought about her mother. She did that sometimes when she was in situations she didn't know how to process, reached for Margaret Hayes like a hand reaching for a lamp in a dark room, knowing the lamp wasn't there anymore but reaching anyway. Her mother had been the kind of woman who could walk into any situation and find the thing she could control and start there. Don't look at the whole problem, Eleanor. Find one thing you can do right now and do it. Tomorrow, she would learn the layout of this place. She would learn where things were kept and how the routine ran and what was expected of her and what she could push back on. That was one thing. That was what she could do. She lay down on top of the blanket in her dress and was asleep before she'd finished the thought. She woke to an empty cabin. The fire had been fed, recently, from the warmth of it, and a pot of water had been set to heat on the stove. On the table, a piece of dried flatbread sat on a cloth, and beside it, a small dish of something dark that turned out to be a berry preserve of some kind, a little too tart to be called sweet, but better than nothing. There was no note because presumably Rowan Hale was not a man who left notes, but the message was clear enough in the arrangement of objects. Breakfast. Here. Go ahead. Eleanor ate standing up again, watching the gray early morning light come through the east-facing window. Then she put on her coat and went outside to learn the property. It took her most of the morning. The cabin sat on a gentle rise with a clear view south down the valley, sheltered on the north and west by a dense stand of lodgepole pine that cut the worst of the winter wind. The outbuildings were minimal but sound, a small stable with room for 2 horses, currently housing only one, a gray gelding who accepted Eleanor's hand on his nose with the bored tolerance of an animal accustomed to strangers, a low-roofed shed that housed tools and the overflow of the woodpile, a root cellar dug into the slope behind the cabin that, when Eleanor hauled open the heavy door, revealed a degree of preparation that actually stopped her cold for a moment. The root cellar was full, not adequate, not getting by full. Full in the way that suggested serious, sustained effort over a long period, barrels of salted meat, crocks of preserved vegetables, sacks of dried beans and cornmeal, a cured ham hanging from a hook in the ceiling, Shelves of jarred goods lined up with a neatness that seemed almost at odds with the general spare functionality of everything else on the property. Eleanor stood in the entrance of the root cellar in the cold morning air and did the math automatically, the way she'd been doing food calculations since she was 14, and what she came up with was a supply that could sustain 2 people, comfortably, for 5 months. Maybe 6 if they were careful. He had prepared for her. She didn't know what to do with that. It was too large a fact to absorb quickly, so she filed it where she filed things she couldn't process yet, in the back somewhere, to be examined later, and closed the cellar door and went back to the cabin to start figuring out the kitchen. By the time Rowan returned in the early afternoon, Eleanor had reorganized the dry goods shelf, located every pot and pan on the property, discovered that the chimney drew slightly better if the damper was set at a particular angle, and started a pot of beans that would be ready by evening. She'd also found, tucked in a corner behind the wood box, a small clay jug that turned out to contain a quantity of whiskey she had absolutely no intention of mentioning. He came in with 2 rabbits, and the particular quality of cold that means someone has been outside for a long time. He stopped when he saw the reorganized shelf, and she braced herself. Some men were particular about where things were kept, territorial about it in ways that could turn into something ugly faster than you expected. He looked at the shelf. He looked at her. "Makes sense," he said, and hung the rabbits on the hook by the door for cleaning. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That was how the first week went. Not easily. Nothing about it was easy, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. But without the disasters she'd been tensed against. She learned the cabin's rhythms. He left before first light and returned by mid-afternoon. He did not explain himself or his schedule, but he also didn't disappear without leaving the fire fed and some arrangement for her morning meal, and he always came back when the light started to fail, which she eventually realized she had started counting on more than she'd intended to. They ate together every evening. The conversations were short and sometimes blunt and occasionally awkward in the specific way of 2 people who are still figuring out what they're allowed to say to each other, but they were real. He asked, one evening in the second week, whether the arrangement of the bedroom was working for her or whether she needed anything different. She asked him, 2 days later, why he'd left the trading post before speaking to anyone when she'd watched him from across the settlement the previous spring. He looked at her for a long moment before he said, "Marsh was there," in a tone that closed the subject without slamming a door on it. She filed that away too. The clay jug. The look on Thomas Hayes's face when he'd turned the wagon around. The way Rowan had paid a debt that was not his to pay. These were pieces of something she didn't have the full shape of yet. Then came the day she met Eli Marsh, and the shape started to get a lot clearer. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, and she had walked down to the settlement to pick up thread and a tin of salt from the trading post. The first time she'd made the trip alone, partly because she'd needed the supplies, and partly because she'd needed badly an hour that was just hers, just the cold air and the road and no one making any claims on her attention. The trading post was busy. 3 or 4 other women were inside. The Pierce girls, old Martha Kinney, and a young woman Eleanor didn't know who was trying to manage a toddler determined to dismantle the lower shelf of spice tins. Eli Marsh was behind the counter. Eleanor had seen him before, at a distance, the way you see most people in a settlement this size. A broad impression, nothing specific. Up close, in the particular gray indoor light of the trading post, she revised her impression immediately and instinctively, the way you do when something your body registers as a warning shows up in person. He was maybe 50, well-fed in the way of a man who hadn't missed meals in decades, with a broad red face and eyes that moved too quickly over everything in a room, tallying and calculating in a way that wasn't subtle if you were paying attention. He smiled when Eleanor came in, and the smile was perfectly sociable and perfectly empty, and he said, "Mrs. Hale," with an emphasis on the name that was just barely, just slightly, a degree too pointed to be neutral. "Thread and salt, please," Eleanor said. "Of course." He moved around the counter, came closer than the transaction required. "How are you finding it up there? Comfortable?" "Fine." "Rowan treating you well?" Still that smile. "He's a quiet man. Some women find it—" He paused, searching for a word he'd already chosen. "Difficult. Not knowing what someone's thinking. Eleanor looked at him directly. I find it suits me. Something flickered in those fast-moving eyes. Then the smile widened slightly, which was worse than when it narrowed would have been. I'm sure it does. You're your father's daughter, practical woman. I've always admired that about the Hayes family. He handed her the thread and the salt tin. Tell Rowan I said hello. She left without answering. She walked back up the valley road faster than she'd walked down it, and the feeling that followed her wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you see a thing you already suspected confirmed. When the puzzle piece you were missing turns up and you realize the picture it completes is worse than the picture you'd been imagining. Rowan was in the stable when she got back, working on a piece of harness leather with a stitching awl. He looked up when she came in, registered something in her face immediately, and set down the awl. I met Eli Marsh today, Eleanor said. A pause. I know. Pierce girl mentioned you were going down. Why didn't you tell me to avoid him? Would it have changed whether you needed thread and salt? Eleanor opened her mouth and then closed it, because that was actually a fair point and she was annoyed by it. No, she admitted. Rowan picked up the awl again, turned the piece of harness over in his hands. He wasn't avoiding her eyes. He was thinking, and thinking for him looked like that, like he was handling the words before he used them. He owns the note on your father's debt, Rowan said finally. Did before I paid it. He does that, finds the people who are close to the edge and makes it easy to fall over. Then he owns something of theirs. And now? Now the debt is mine. What does that mean for you? He looked up at her then. Nothing I can't manage. It was not a complete answer, and they both knew it, but he'd said enough for her to understand the architecture of it. Marsh had owned her father. Rowan had stepped in and taken on that ownership, redirected it, removed it from Thomas Hayes, and put it somewhere Marsh couldn't leverage into a claim on Eleanor's family's property or livelihood or safety. He had walked into that trading post and put himself between her family and Eli Marsh, and he had done it without telling anyone, without asking for credit, and without mentioning it to Eleanor in 3 weeks of shared meals and quiet evenings. She stood in the stable doorway for a moment longer, the cold coming through from outside, the smell of hay and horse and leather around her. You should have told me, she said. Maybe, he said. He didn't argue it. Didn't seem like mine to tell. She went back inside. She stood at the stove for a long time with her hands flat on the warm iron surface, not doing anything, just standing there while something she hadn't named yet moved slowly through her like weather moving through a valley. Not gone by the time she lifted her hands, but changed somehow in character. That night she asked him, over supper, about where he'd come from. She'd been waiting to ask, partly because she wasn't sure she was ready for an answer that might complicate what she was slowly, cautiously beginning to think about him, and partly because she'd learned early that the quickest way to make Rowan Hale shut down a conversation was to come at it directly without enough trust built up first. But they had 3 weeks of trust now. Maybe enough. He didn't answer right away. He ate. He looked at the table. She waited him out because she'd learned that about him too. The silences were usually not refusals, just the time he needed to decide what was true enough to say. Missouri, he said. Before that, Ohio. Came out here about 4 years ago. Why? Another pause. I had a partner in a trapping operation. We had a disagreement. What kind of disagreement? He looked at her across the table. The kind where he ended up with everything, and I ended up owing money to people who weren't interested in waiting. Eleanor absorbed that. It wasn't a confession of anything criminal, not exactly, but it was a door left ajar, and she understood that it was the most he'd told anyone here, probably, and that the telling of it cost him something. Did you do something wrong? She asked. He thought about that. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. That's not the same as doing something wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, it's not. She got up and cleared the dishes. He sat at the table a while longer, and when she came back from the dry sink, he was still there, not doing anything, just sitting in the firelight with that quality he had sometimes of being somewhere else slightly while still present in the room. For what it's worth, Eleanor said, not looking at him, folding the cloth she'd used to dry the dishes. I trusted my father not to make decisions about my life without asking me, so I understand the feeling. She heard him exhale, not a laugh exactly, but something adjacent to one. The first sound like that she'd heard from him. I suppose you do, he said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark on the pine needle mattress and listened to the wind that had been building all day, and finally arrived in earnest around midnight, throwing itself against the north side of the cabin with a force that made the walls creak and the fire gutter briefly in the stove before the damper she'd set caught it. The first real snow came the next morning. Eleanor stood at the east window and watched it come down and understood viscerally what old Miller meant when he said this was going to be a hard winter. It wasn't the pretty snow of illustrations and memories. It was heavy, purposeful, committed. The kind of snow that wasn't performing anything, just doing what it came to do, which was to close everything off. By noon, the path to the stable was knee-deep. By evening, it was impassable without the rope Rowan had strung between the cabin door and the stable wall, which Eleanor had noticed 3 days ago without understanding its function until now. He'd thought of that too. He'd strung the rope before the snow came. She found herself thinking about that as she stoked the fire that evening, not the rope itself, but the mind that had strung it. The kind of thinking that happened quietly and in advance, that looked ahead not to its own comfort, but to what other people would need when conditions became difficult. She'd been raised to value that kind of practical forethought, had been practicing it herself since she was 14, and she knew how rare it actually was and how little it tended to announce itself. Rowan came in from the stable that evening with snow on his shoulders and his hands red from the cold, and Eleanor handed him a cup of hot coffee before she'd consciously decided to do it. And he took it without making it into anything, just wrapped his hands around the cup and stood near the stove. And they stood there together in the small warmth while the storm did what it was going to do outside. And Eleanor thought that this exact moment, was the most honest thing that had happened since she'd arrived. Not comfortable, not simple, but honest. She hadn't expected that. 2 days later, old Cora Whitfield sent her boy up the road in the snow to find out if anyone had extra tallow candles to spare, because she'd burned through hers in the storm and her eyes were failing badly enough that darkness frightened her. The boy was maybe 12, half frozen, trying very hard not to look like he'd been crying from the cold. Eleanor brought him inside and gave him something hot and watched him across the table with her hands around her own cup and thought about what she could offer. They had enough candles, barely, if she was careful. She was calculating when Rowan came in from outside, assessed the situation in 3 seconds, went to the storage shelf, took down most of their candle supply without comment, wrapped them in cloth, and handed the bundle to the boy along with a piece of dried meat and directions that meant he could follow the fence line back rather than the road, which was safer in the snow. The boy left with more than he'd come for. Eleanor watched the door close. "That was most of our candles," she said. "We've got the oil lamp," Rowan said, already moving toward the stove, "and the fire. Cora Whitfield has 6 grandchildren living with her." "I know." Eleanor looked at his back for a moment. He was stirring something at the stove, not looking at her, not waiting for acknowledgement, just moving to the next thing. "Did you know her husband used to help my father?" she said, not sure why she was saying it, just following the thread of something. "I know." He glanced over his shoulder briefly. "He died the winter before last. She's been managing on her own since." Eleanor sat down at the table. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said, and she was learning that the spaces around what Rowan did say were just as informative as the words themselves, that you could understand him if you paid attention to both sides of the silence. She paid attention. And in the weeks that followed, as the snow deepened and the valley contracted around itself into the particular intimacy of hard winter, Eleanor started to understand what it was she'd been paying attention to. He brought the elderly Harmon couple firewood twice without being asked, hauling it up their path in the dark of early morning so it would be there when they came out. He repaired the Pierce family's north-facing wall during a brief break in the weather, spending an afternoon she knew he could have used for his own work patching a gap that would have let the cold straight through. He gave away portions of their meat supply on 4 separate occasions, with the quiet matter-of-factness of someone who had done the math and decided other people's needs ranked ahead of his own excess. None of it loud, none of it performed, not a single instance where he mentioned it afterward or seemed to expect Eleanor to mention it. He just did things, the way someone who had decided what kind of person they were going to be does things, consistently, privately, without needing an audience. It was driving Eleanor a little crazy, if she was honest about it, because she'd built a very careful wall in the first weeks here, the same wall she'd been building her whole life, the one that kept expectation at a manageable distance and prevented the specific kind of damage that came from trusting people with the wrong parts of yourself. She'd kept that wall in good repair through her mother's death and her father's failures and every small disappointment that had accumulated over 23 years of being someone the world treated as a supporting character in other people's stories. Rowan Hale was quietly, consistently, without any apparent intention or strategy, dismantling it. She resented it a little. She was also starting to understand that resentment was the wrong word for what she felt, and that the right word was something she wasn't ready to use yet. It was the evening he came home late, later than she'd ever seen him, past the point when the fire had burned down and she'd had to build it back up, past the point where she'd stopped trying not to watch the door. That she finally understood something about the quality of her own waiting. He came in at full dark, which in November meant nearly 6 hours since sunset. He was limping slightly, which he tried to hide and didn't fully manage, and there was a cut on his left hand that had been wrapped in a strip of something that used to be his shirt. Eleanor stood up from the chair by the fire. "What happened?" "Trap," he said. "Lost my footing on the creek bank. It's fine. Let me see it." "Eleanor, sit down and let me see it." He sat down. Not because she told him to, she understood that about him by now. That compliance with direct instructions wasn't in his nature any more than it was in hers, but because he was tired enough that sitting felt like relief, and because something in her voice must have communicated that this was not the moment for independence. She unwrapped his hand. The cut was not fine, not exactly, deep enough that it had bled significantly and had been bleeding again with exertion, though it had started to close. She cleaned it with what she had, which was not much, and rebandaged it with more care than he'd given it himself. And she was in the middle of tying off the bandage when she became aware that he was watching her face. She looked up. He looked away, but not fast enough. "It's going to hurt tomorrow," she said. "It already hurts," he said. A pause. "Thank you." She tied the last knot. She was still holding his hand, she realized, not because the task required it anymore. She set it down on the table, carefully, and stood up. "I had supper ready 2 hours ago," she said. "It's held." "I'm sorry I was late." She stopped. She hadn't expected that. Not the apology exactly, but the naturalness of it, the fact that he'd offered it without being asked and without qualification. She'd spent 3 weeks building a picture of this man out of available evidence and adjusting it as new evidence came in, and she was starting to understand that the picture was going to keep requiring adjustment, that she had underestimated him in the way you underestimate quiet things, because quiet things don't announce themselves. "It's held," she said again. "Sit there." She got the supper. He ate it with his bandaged hand in his lap, managing with the one that worked. And he didn't complain about the cold temperature of it, or the fact that it was late, or anything else. And she sat across from him and watched him eat, and tried to figure out what she was going to do with a person like this. She didn't have an answer yet, but she was starting to think she'd been asking the wrong question. The hand healed crooked, not badly, not in a way that would cost him function, but there was a small ridge of scar tissue along the base of his left palm that Eleanor noticed 2 weeks after the creek bank incident when he was working a piece of harness leather at the table, and she caught the angle of it in the firelight. She didn't say anything. She just registered it the way she registered most things about Rowan Hale now, adding it to the accumulating inventory of a person she was still in the process of learning. December arrived the way it always arrived in this valley, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door someone had been holding shut finally giving way. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night and didn't come back up. The creek at the bottom of the property froze solid enough to walk on. The snow that had been falling intermittently since November became a permanent condition of the landscape, and the sky settled into the flat white gray of serious winter, the kind that doesn't perform or threaten, but simply is. Eleanor had grown up in this valley. She knew winter. but she'd never spent one this far up the slope, where the wind had more room to build before it hit something, and where the isolation was a different quality than what she'd known in her father's house inside the settlement. Down there, isolation meant you couldn't get to town. Up here, it meant that on certain mornings you could stand at the east window and see nothing in any direction that suggested another human being had ever existed. She found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind it the way she'd expected to. Part of that was the work, which was relentless and absorbing in a way that left little room for the kind of thinking that spirals into itself. Keeping the cabin warm required constant management of the fire and the woodpile. Keeping them fed required daily attention to what they had, what they were using, and how to stretch both without making the meals so spare that they were losing condition they'd need for the physical demands of the days. She made a chart in her head, the kind she used to make for her father's household, and adjusted it weekly based on consumption and Rowan's hauls from his trap lines, which were good some weeks and thin others depending on what the weather was doing to the animal movement patterns he'd spent 3 years learning. And part of it, the part she admitted only to herself in the privacy of the hour before sleep when her mind ran without supervision, was Rowan. Not in the way that made her uncomfortable to examine, not yet, but in the simpler sense that he was a present, steady, known quantity in her days, and she had underestimated how much that would matter. She'd spent years being the steady presence for other people, for her father, for the household, for the settlement's various small crises that somehow always seemed to find their way to a capable woman's door. She hadn't understood until now, here, in this cabin on this hillside, that she had never had a steady presence in return. She was not going to say that to him. She barely said it to herself. But she knew it. The first serious trouble came on a Thursday in mid-December, 12 days after a blizzard had laid down 3 feet of new snow on top of what was already there. She was in the root cellar taking inventory when she heard the sound. A horse, moving fast, which was wrong on multiple levels because fast movement in snow, this deep meant something urgent enough to risk injuring the animal. She came up out of the cellar and saw young Pete Garner from the settlement below pulling his horse to a stop in front of the cabin, the animal's sides heaving and dark with sweat despite the cold. Mrs. Hale. Pete was 17, the oldest boy of a family of 6 who lived at the south end of the valley, and his face was doing the thing young men's faces do when they're frightened and trying to perform composure over the top of it. "Is Rowan here?" "He's on the north line," Eleanor said. "Won't be back until afternoon. What's wrong?" Pete's composure slipped. "It's the Harmon place. Mr. Harmon, he fell this morning trying to get to the woodpile and he can't get up. Mrs. Harmon's been out there with him for an hour, but she can't lift him, and nobody could get through the drifts on the east path until I went around by the ridge." Eleanor was already moving. "Get your horse under cover," she said. "Stable's open. Then come inside." She went into the cabin and thought for approximately 15 seconds about what needed to happen and in what order. The Harmon place was 1.5 miles down the slope by the direct path, which was currently impassable, or 3 miles by the ridge route that Pete had found. Alfred Harmon was in his late 70s and had been declining for 2 seasons. She'd seen that at the settlement, the slow compression of a man who'd been large in his health. A fall in this cold, lying in the snow for an hour, was not a small thing. She left a note on the table, 3 words, "Harmon, coming back," and took the medical kit she'd assembled from her mother's herbs and whatever she'd found in the cabin's limited supplies, and her heaviest coat, and she went. Pete led her by the ridge route. It took the better part of 2 hours through snow that sometimes came to her hip, and once required Pete to go ahead and pack it down enough for her to follow. She didn't complain because complaint didn't make the snow shallower, but she was winded in a way that scared her a little by the time they came down off the ridge and the Harmon cabin came into view. Agnes Harmon was in the doorway, watching them come. She was a small woman, iron-haired, who had outlasted everything the frontier had put in her path for 50 years, and she was crying, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the state of things. Alfred was inside, on the floor beside the woodbox where he'd fallen. He was conscious but gray-faced and shaking with cold that had settled into him, despite the blankets Agnes had piled on, and the fire she'd built up as high as she dared. His right leg was wrong, not visibly broken through the skin, but bent at an angle that it shouldn't have been. Eleanor knelt beside him. "Mr. Harmon, can you hear me?" "I hear you." His voice was thin but present. "Fool thing to do." It was, she agreed, because false comfort from strangers irritates people who have been managing their own lives for 7 decades. I'm going to look at your leg. This is going to hurt. It did. He made a sound low in his throat and then went silent and still while she examined as carefully as she could. And what she determined was what she'd feared. The upper leg, not the lower. And at his age and in this cold and with no physician within 4 days' travel, there was a very limited number of good outcomes available. She got him off the floor with Pete's help and onto the bed, which was the right call, because it had to happen and delaying it only prolonged the cold exposure. Then she splinted the leg as well as she could with what was available, which was not well enough but was better than nothing, and she gave him the willow bark tea she'd prepared from her kit and stayed through the afternoon talking to Agnes about what the next days needed to look like. She was still there when Rowan arrived. She heard the horse first, his particular gait, which she had learned the way you learn sounds that signal something specific. He came through the door and took the room in without speaking, and his eyes went to Eleanor first, and then to the bed, and then back to Eleanor, and she saw something move through his expression that she didn't have a word for. Pete found me on the way back, he said, came down the ridge. The leg's bad, Eleanor said quietly, stepping away from the bed to meet him near the door. He needs to stay still and warm and off it, and Agnes can't manage the wood and the water and the cooking alone. I'll handle the wood, Rowan said. He said it the same way he'd said everything he'd ever committed to. Without drama, without calculation, like the decision was already behind him and he was simply reporting it. Rowan, your own lines can wait a few days. Eleanor looked at him. It might be more than a few days. I know. He held her gaze. He was not asking for anything back. He was not performing sacrifice. He simply looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, like she was a person whose opinion was worth having, but whose permission he didn't require to do the right thing. She let out a breath. I'll work out a schedule with Agnes. Come back in the morning. She walked home by herself in the dark. With a lantern Pete lent her, and the rope route Rowan had already strung between the Harmon property and the main track. She found it in the dark and understood he'd done it before he'd come inside, in the cold, before he knew how long he'd need to stay. She followed it hand over hand through the last quarter mile, the lantern swinging, the cold absolute and indifferent. And she thought about a man who strung ropes in the dark so other people could find their way. And she thought about it all the way home and for a long time after she got there. She was at the table with her coat still on when she found the letter. It wasn't where it was meant for her. It was tucked into the frame of the shelf above the dry sink, folded small, and she only found it because she was putting away the medical kit and her hand brushed it. Her name was on the outside in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her father's. She stood at the dry sink for a long moment before she opened it. It was not a long letter. Her father had never been a man of many written words, and this was not the letter of a man who'd changed that quality about himself. It was dated 6 weeks earlier, before the snow, before the pass closed, which meant he'd sent it with someone coming up the valley road and asked them to leave it at the cabin without making anything of it. It said, Eleanor, I have been trying to work out how to say something, and I haven't found the right way, so I will just say it plainly. Before you went up there, I went to Rowan Hale, and I told him he was taking a wife. He told me he wasn't. He told me he would provide for you and give you a place and keep you safe through the winter, but he said he wasn't going to hold you to anything you hadn't agreed to yourself, and he made me promise to tell you that before you left. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you wouldn't go, and I was afraid of what Marsh would do if the arrangement fell through. I should have told you. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things. Your father. Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it down on the dry sink and stood there with her hands flat on the wood surface and looked at nothing for a long time. He had told her father to give her a choice before she arrived, before she'd walked through that door with her 2 bags and her prepared speech about standards and treatment. He had already told Thomas Hayes that he wouldn't hold her to an arrangement she hadn't made for herself, and he had let her spend 6 weeks believing she had no choice. She felt several things simultaneously, and none of them were simple. There was something warm moving through the center of what she felt, and around that warmth there was something harder, not quite anger, but close to it, close enough that she needed to examine it carefully before she decided what it was. He should have told her. She sat down at the table with the letter in front of her and worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, following each thought to its logical end before she moved to the next. He should have told her. That was true. She'd spent weeks feeling trapped in a situation that apparently contained a door she didn't know about, and not knowing about that door had cost her something, some degree of agency over her own understanding of where she stood. But he had made that arrangement with her father before he'd ever met her, before he knew anything about who she was or what she needed or how she thought. He had decided in advance to protect her freedom from himself, from the arrangement, from the debt and the pressure and the whole constructed situation that had brought her here. He had decided that before she walked through his door. She thought about the root cellar, full to the rafters with food he'd put up for a person he'd never spoken to. She thought about the bedroll beside the stove every single morning, without complaint or comment. She thought about the rope between the cabin and the stable, strung before the snow came. She thought about all the ways he had been preparing for her without knowing her, and about the one thing he had prepared that she'd only just found out about, the door in the wall that she could have walked through at any time, that he had put there and never mentioned. She stayed up very late that night. When Rowan came in from his last check of the stable, he always did one late check, she'd learned, a habit of someone who'd lost an animal to a cold night once and hadn't forgotten it. She was still at the table. He looked at her. He looked at the letter, visible on the table between them. He stopped in the middle of the room. "My father wrote to me," she said. The silence had its own texture. She'd learned to read them by now. This one was the kind that meant he was deciding something, figuring out what was owed in this moment. "When did he send it?" Rowan said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "Before the pass closed." She looked at him. "You told him to give me a choice." He didn't answer. He didn't deny it. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" She kept her voice level. She wasn't performing calm. She was genuinely trying to understand before she decided how angry she had a right to be. "When I walked in here with my speech about standards, you could have told me then." He crossed to the table and sat down in his chair across from her, slowly, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her. "You needed to know what the situation was before you could decide anything about it. If I'd told you the minute you arrived, it would have felt like—" He stopped, tried again. "It would have felt like I was offering you something to get something back." Eleanor sat with that. "And if you waited until I'd seen who you were? Then it would be real," he said. "Or it would be nothing. Either way, it would be yours to decide." She looked at him across the table. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was dimmer than usual, and in that low light she could see him the way you sometimes see people you know well. Not the details, but the thing underneath the details, the shape of who they actually are when they're not managing how they're seen. "You were afraid," she said. She said it quietly, not as an accusation. "Not of me. You were afraid of getting it wrong, of having me feel like I owed you something." His jaw moved slightly. "Yes." She nodded. She picked up the letter and folded it back along its creases and held it in both hands and said, "Don't do that again. Don't decide what I can and can't handle." "No," he said. "I won't." She believed him. That was the thing she noticed. Not that he said it, but that she believed it immediately, without qualification, in the way you believe things that have been earned rather than just stated. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the whole structure of what she'd believed about her situation rebuilding itself around a different load-bearing wall. She was not trapped. She had never been trapped. She had chosen to stay. The week that followed was strange in the way of weeks where something has fundamentally shifted, but the surface of daily life looks the same as it always has. They hauled water. They managed the fire. He checked the trap lines and she worked the cellar inventory, and they cooked and ate and did the 1,000 small tasks that winter demanded, and none of it looked different from the outside. But something between them had changed pitch. Some frequency had shifted that she felt in her back teeth, in the way she heard his footsteps crossing the floor in the morning, in the way conversations that had been careful were now, occasionally, careless in the way that real conversations are. She told him about her mother on a Sunday evening when the storm that had been building for 2 days finally committed and the cabin became its own small world, fully contained, fully sealed off from everything outside it. She hadn't planned to. She was talking about the book of poetry on the shelf, her mother's book, the one with the leather strip holding the spine together. And then she was talking about Margaret Hayes. And she kept going because Rowan was listening in the particular way he had, the way that meant he was actually receiving what she was saying rather than waiting for his turn. She told him about the fever winter, about being 14 and not understanding yet that grief takes longer than you think it will, that you don't get through it, you just get used to carrying it. About her father's particular brand of well-intentioned uselessness in the aftermath, the way he'd retreated into the practical business of survival in a way that left no room for the kind of conversation Eleanor had desperately needed and had eventually stopped looking for. He didn't know how, Rowan said. Not an excuse, not a defense, just an observation, offered carefully. No. Eleanor looked at the fire. I know that now. I didn't know it then. When you're 14 and your mother is gone and your father looks right through you, you don't understand the difference between can't and won't. You figured it out eventually. I figured out how to manage it eventually. That's not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My father was the same. Different reasons. Same result. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. He wasn't a bad man either, Rowan said. He'd built this wall between himself and everything that could hurt him, and by the time I was old enough to notice, the wall was so high that nothing else could get through either. Not the bad things, not the good things. A pause. I spent a long time making sure I wasn't doing that. Is that why you're quiet? She asked. Because you're afraid of building the wall? He turned and looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind he gave when she'd gotten somewhere close to something true. I'm quiet because I learned early that most talking is noise. The things that matter, you show. Eleanor held that for a moment. Then she said, You could do both, show and tell. It's not one or the other. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, not enough to call it that, but the direction of a smile. I'm working on it, he said. She almost laughed. It came up in her throat and she let part of it out, and the sound of it surprised her enough that she stopped. And then Rowan made that sound she'd heard once before, adjacent to a laugh, not quite there. And they sat by the dying fire in the middle of a blizzard and were, for a few minutes, just two people who had managed to find something unexpectedly real in a situation that had started as the opposite of that. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, with the wind so high that the rope between the cabin and stable was vibrating audibly, Eleanor was in the middle of the main room checking the damper on the stove when the ceiling above the northeast corner made a sound she had never heard a ceiling make. She looked up. Rowan was already on his feet. The snow load on the roof had been building for days. She'd known this. He'd known this. They discussed it in the abstract way of people who know something is a risk but can't do anything about it until conditions allow. The sound came again, a deep, slow creak that moved through the structure of the cabin the way a crack moves through ice. Get your coat, Rowan said. He was already pulling on his own. The stable. The roof. The center beam is holding, but that northeast corner isn't sound. Get your coat now. She got her coat. They went out into the wind, the force of it physical, something you had to lean into and push against. And she followed the rope to the stable while he went back around to the north side of the cabin with a long-handled tool she couldn't see clearly in the blowing snow. She understood what he was doing before she got to the stable door. He was trying to shift the snow load from the roof, raking it off the compromised corner, in wind and darkness and cold that made every action 3 times harder than it should have been. She got the horse settled and stood in the stable doorway, watching the shape of him moving in the blowing white, and felt something she had no word for at that moment. Something that had fear at its base, and something else layered over the fear, something that was very close to not being able to imagine a version of the next hour that didn't have him in it. He came back in 20 minutes. He was completely covered in snow, his face red where it had been exposed, and he moved like someone who'd been fighting something the whole time he was out there. Corner's clear, he said. Should hold. Eleanor handed him the blanket she'd pulled from the horse's back. You could have told me what you were doing before you went out there. He took the blanket. Didn't want to waste the 2 seconds. Rowan. He looked at her. Don't do that either, she said. Don't go out alone in a blizzard without telling me what you're doing. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that look again. The one she'd learned meant he was receiving what she was saying past the words, reading what was underneath them. All right, he said. They waited out the rest of the storm in the stable, sitting on opposite sides of the gray gelding, because the animal's warmth was the most efficient heat source available. Rowan told her about the worst winter he'd trapped through in Ohio, which was not as cold as this but had lasted longer. She told him about the winter she was 16 when the family's root cellar had flooded, and they'd lost 2 months of preserved food in a night, and she'd spent 3 days afterward calculating and recalculating to figure out how to feed them both, until spring. How did you manage it? He asked. I traded labor for supplies. Spent 2 months doing work for every family in the settlement who had something to spare. My father never knew how I managed it. I never told him. Why not? She thought about it. Because he would have felt responsible, and he would have tried to fix it somehow and made it worse, and I would have had to undo whatever he'd done while also doing everything I was already doing. She paused. Some things are easier to handle alone. Rowan didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, You've been alone a long time. She started to deflect. She could feel the reflex of it, the automatic redirect she'd been using her whole life when someone got too close to something true. But she stopped it. She sat with the sentence for a moment. Yes, she said, I have. The storm broke on the 3rd day, the way storms break, suddenly without apology, as if the intensity of the previous days had simply consumed itself and left silence in the place of noise. Eleanor walked out into the aftermath with Rowan and looked at the world the storm had made, the changed heights of drifts, the flattened woodpile cover that needed immediate attention, the roof corner that had held. They worked side by side for most of the morning without talking much, moving through the list of things the storm had left behind. She noticed something about the way they moved around each other, an adjustment, a coordination that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. They handed each other things without being asked. They switched tasks without needing to discuss it. At one point she started a sentence and he finished it. Not the romantic completion of a shared thought, but the practical efficiency of 2 people who had learned to read the logic of each other's thinking. She noticed it and thought, this is what it looks like when something works. Not easy, not perfect. Functional in the deep sense of the word, the way the cabin was functional, built to last, tested against hard conditions, sound where it counted. She didn't know what it meant about what she felt, not yet. She was careful with herself about that. She had learned the hard way about the difference between gratitude and something deeper, between relying on a person and trusting one, and she wasn't going to collapse those categories just because the last month had been what it had been. But she was honest enough to sit with the question now, which was more than she'd been able to do when she arrived. That afternoon, when the light was starting to fail and they'd come back inside and the fire was built and supper was started, she was standing at the stove and she heard Rowan behind her go still in a way that was different from his normal stillness, and she turned. He was looking at the shelf above the dry sink, at the empty place where the letter had been before she'd moved it to the bedroom. He was not going to ask. She understood that about him. He would not ask, because asking felt to him like requiring something she hadn't offered freely. I kept it, she said, in case you were wondering. He looked at her. I wasn't going to. I know you weren't. She turned back to the stove. I kept it anyway. She heard him exhale. She heard him move to the table and sit down. She heard the small sound of him setting his hands flat on the wood, and she knew without looking that he was sitting there with something in his chest that he didn't have words for yet, and she thought, neither do I. Neither do I. But they had time. That was one thing the winter gave without qualification. Time, locked in, unavoidable, with nowhere else to be and nothing pressing against the hours except the cold and the dark and the slowly building truth of who they were to each other. The question was what they were going to do with it. Eleanor stopped counting the days sometime in January, not because she lost track, She was too organized a person to lose track of something as basic as the calendar, but because the counting had started to feel like a habit she'd brought with her from a different life, one where she'd been measuring how long she had to endure something before something else began. She didn't need to measure anymore. The days were just days, full of their own specific weight and texture, and she moved through them without the constant background calculation of how many remained. She noticed this change the way you notice most things about yourself. After the fact, looking back at where you'd been standing a month ago and realizing you weren't standing there anymore. January was the month that broke 3 families in the valley below and held 4 others together by margins so thin they didn't bear examining too closely. The Pierce family lost half their livestock to a cold snap that killed animals in their sleep. Eleanor heard about it from Pete Garner, who came up the ridge route twice a week now, ostensibly checking on the Harmon place, but also, she understood, checking on them, because someone in the settlement had apparently decided that the Hale cabin was the closest thing to a reliable fixed point in an unreliable season. The Brant family's well froze solid and stayed that way for 11 days, which meant hauling water from the creek, which meant 2 people doing the work of 4 in cold that made every trip a negotiation with your own body's willingness to keep moving. Rowan handled most of it without being asked. That was the fact Eleanor kept returning to, not because it surprised her anymore. She'd stopped being surprised by it sometime around the Harmon incident, but because she was trying to understand the architecture of a person who operated this way, who saw need the way other people saw weather, as simply a condition of the landscape that required a response. He came back one afternoon in the second week of January with his coat wet through on one side and his left boot dark with water, which meant he'd gone through the ice somewhere, and when she asked him where he'd been, he said, matter-of-factly, that he'd helped Jonas Brant shore up the creek access point so the water haul was less dangerous. He said it the same way he might have said he'd checked the trap line, as an item, a thing that had happened in the day's list of things. "You went through the ice," Eleanor said. "The edge, not the middle." He was already pulling off the wet boot with the focused attention of a man solving a minor logistical problem. That distinction matters less than you think when the water is that temperature. He looked up at her. There was something in his expression she'd come to recognize. The slight adjustment that meant he'd registered she was worried, and that the worry mattered to him, and that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. "I was careful." "Rowan, careful doesn't keep you out of freezing water." "I know." He set the boot aside. His sock was soaked through and his foot was an alarming shade of red heading toward white at the toes. "I probably should have gone around." That was as close as he got to admitting he'd made a mistake in judgment, and she understood by now that it was actually quite far for him. She got the basin and the heated water from the stove reservoir and knelt on the floor in front of where he sat and put his foot in it without asking his permission. And he let her, which was also quite far for him. "The Brants have 6 people in that house," he said after a minute. "I know they do. 4 of them are children." She looked up at him. He was looking at his foot in the basin or at the floor near it, and his jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was saying something he felt he had to justify, which meant it was something he'd done that he knew she had a right to be frustrated about. "I know," she said again, quietly. She wasn't going to tell him he was wrong. She wasn't going to tell him he was right, either. She dried his foot when the feeling came back into it, and she went and made coffee, and she set a cup in front of him, and that was the conversation. He understood what it meant. She saw it in the way he picked up the cup. The crisis with Eli Marsh came on a Friday at the end of January, and it came, as his kind of trouble usually did, through someone else first. Agnes Harmon arrived at the cabin without Pete, which was the first thing wrong, because Agnes didn't walk the ridge route alone in January without a reason. She was breathing hard when Eleanor opened the door, and her face had the tight, compressed look of a woman carrying news she didn't want to deliver. "Marsh came to see Alfred yesterday," Agnes said, before Eleanor had finished opening the door all the way. "With papers." Eleanor stepped back and let her in. Rowan was at the table sharpening a knife, and he set it down the moment Agnes came through the door. "What kind of papers?" Eleanor said. Agnes sat down heavily in the chair Rowan pulled out for her. She was 71 years old and had walked 3 miles in January cold, and the effort was visible. "He says Alfred borrowed against the property 2 years ago, before the fall. He says the note is due in spring, and if they can't pay, the cabin and the land go to him. She looked at her hands, which were clasped together hard enough that the knuckles were blanched. Alfred says he doesn't remember signing anything, but his memory. You know how Alfred's memory is now. Eleanor looked at Rowan. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Agnes with an expression she could only describe as contained fury, everything held inside a very deliberate stillness. Do you have the papers? Eleanor asked. Marsh has them. Of course he does, Eleanor said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice, the sound of something she'd been waiting for. Eli Marsh and his fast-moving eyes and his perfectly sociable smile and his habit of finding people close to the edge. Alfred Harmon, with his failing memory and his broken leg and his 70-plus years of trusting that the world was fundamentally fair. It was almost elegant, in the way of the worst things. Everything timed perfectly. The debt called in when the weather made it impossible to travel to anyone who could help. When Alfred couldn't walk and Agnes couldn't fight, and the valley was too buried in snow for outside accountability to reach them. Rowan stood up. I'll go see Marsh, he said. Rowan, Eleanor started. I know what I'm doing. I know you know what you're doing. I'm asking you to tell me what it is before you do it. He stopped. He looked at her. The ghost of something moved across his face, recognition, maybe, of her own words coming back to him in his voice. He told her 2 months ago that he was working on it, showing and telling both. Marsh has been buying notes on properties in this valley for 3 years, he said. I've been watching him do it. I have a record of transactions, dates, amounts, properties, that the county land office doesn't have. If those records were made available to the right people. He paused. There's a circuit judge who comes through in April. I've been waiting. Eleanor stared at him. You've been building a case. I didn't know when I'd need it. You knew you'd need it eventually. Yes. She sat down at the table, not because she needed to sit, but because she needed a moment to absorb the scale of what he'd just said. 3 years of quiet, patient, completely unseen documentation against a man who'd had the whole valley convinced he was untouchable. She thought about Rowan arriving here 4 years ago from Ohio, from a partnership that had gone wrong, from the specific education of being on the losing end of a powerful man's manipulation. She thought about what a person does with that kind of education when they have both the will and the patience to use it. Where are the records? She asked. He crossed to the storage shelf, moved 3 crocks of preserved goods, and removed a flat tin box from the back of the shelf that she had never, in 3 months of living in this cabin, noticed. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside, folded carefully and organized in a way that spoke of repeated consultation, were papers, dates, figures, names, property descriptions, in Rowan's small, compressed handwriting. Agnes Harmon looked at the papers, and then at Rowan, and then at Eleanor. How long have you been doing this? She said. Since I got here, Rowan said. There was a silence. Eleanor looked at the papers and thought about a man who had arrived in this valley 4 years ago, having been taken apart by someone with power and no conscience, and who had sat quietly in his cabin on the hill and watched and waited and written things down, and had never mentioned it to anyone, not because he was hiding it, but because he had not yet needed it and saw no reason to make noise about something that wasn't ready. You should have told someone, Agnes said. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of an old woman looking at a resource that had been sitting unused while people suffered. I know, Rowan said. He said it to Agnes, and he also, Eleanor understood, said it to her. The same admission, the same flaw. The instinct to manage things alone, to hold things until they were ready, to be so careful about having an impact on other people that he withheld things they might have needed sooner. All right, Eleanor said. She pulled the papers toward her. Let me look at these. She spent 2 hours at the table while Agnes rested and Rowan sat across from her and answered her questions. She had not had formal education beyond what the settlement schoolroom had offered through her 12th year, but she had spent her entire adult life managing resources and accounting for what she had against what was needed, and the logic of financial documentation was not foreign to her. What Rowan had built, she realized slowly, was not just a record. It was a pattern, laid out in dates and numbers, that showed a methodology. Marsh didn't make loans in good faith. He made loans to people he'd already identified as unable to repay, under conditions timed to their most vulnerable moments. And he'd been doing it consistently enough that the pattern was unmistakable if you had all the transactions in one place, which no one had until now. "This is enough," Eleanor said. "For a judge who's looking for it, this is enough." "It needs to get to someone before April," Rowan said. "Can we get word out before the pass opens?" "Maybe, if the weather gives us a window." He looked at the papers. "There's a man in the next county, retired magistrate. If someone could reach him before full thaw—" "I'll go," Eleanor said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when someone says something that surprises the room, including themselves. "The pass isn't safe until—" Rowan started. "I didn't say the pass. Pete Garner told me about a southern route through the low hills that stays passable most of the winter. Longer, but manageable." She looked at him. "I know how to travel in cold weather. I've done it before. Not 4 days of it alone." "I wouldn't be alone. Pete knows the route, and he's been wanting something useful to do for 6 weeks." Rowan looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, could see him pulling up every objection and then testing it against what he knew about her, which was by now considerably more than what he'd known when she arrived. She waited him out. "Pete's a reliable boy," he said finally. "I know he is. You'd leave in 2 days. Weather window looks like it opens Tuesday." "Tuesday works." He was quiet for another moment. "You take the gray." "I was going to ask." He looked at Agnes. Agnes was looking at Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and the particular recognition of one woman seeing another woman act on her own authority and being glad of it. "All right," Rowan said. Not easily. She could hear the effort in it, the way it cost him to let her take the risk instead of taking it himself. But he said it. That was the point. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, just a moment, just the pressure of her palm against his knuckles. She'd never done that before. He went very still under her hand. She pulled it back and started making a list of what she'd need for the journey. She left Tuesday before dawn, with Pete Garner and the gray gelding, and a copy of Rowan's papers tucked inside her coat against her skin, folded inside the oilcloth wrapping she'd made the night before. Rowan was at the stable when she brought the gray out, checking the saddle rigging with the focused thoroughness of someone who needed to do something useful with his hands. He didn't tell her to be careful. She was grateful for that. She'd have said something sharp in response, because careful was a word people used when they didn't know how to say what they actually meant. What he said instead, without looking up from the rigging, was, "There's dried meat and hardtack in the left saddlebag, more than you'll need." "Of course there is," she said. He looked up then. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see his face more clearly than she usually could, because something in it was less managed than usual. He wasn't performing steadiness. He was just standing there being a person who was watching someone he valued ride into the cold and couldn't do a thing about it. "I'll be back in 8 days," she said. "Maybe 7 if the southern route is faster than Pete thinks." 8 is fine. She gathered the reins. "The Harmon place." "I'll check every day." She nodded. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the gray, and she looked down at him from that new height and thought about everything she knew about Rowan Hale that she hadn't known when she'd arrived in October with her 2 bags and her speech about standards, and she thought it was a remarkable list for 3 months. "Keep the northeast corner of the roof cleared if we get accumulation," she said. "Eleanor." "Yes?" He put his hand on the gray's neck. He looked up at her. "Come back," he said. Just that. She felt it somewhere central, somewhere that was not her chest, but in the general region of it. "That was always the plan," she said. She rode down the slope with Pete and didn't look back until the tree line took the cabin from view, and then she allowed herself to look once, quickly, and then she faced forward and rode. The journey south was not what Eleanor would have called comfortable at any point over the 4 days it took. The Low Hills route was indeed passable, as Pete had said, but passable was a relative term in January. It meant possible, not easy, and the two of them picked their way through it carefully, camping in whatever shelter the terrain offered, managing their fire situation with the discipline of people who understood what inadequate warmth in these temperatures would cost them. Pete was good company, better than she'd expected. He talked when talking helped pass the time, and fell silent when silence was more useful, which was a quality Eleanor respected in anyone. They reached the retired magistrate's house on the afternoon of the fourth day. His name was Callum Reed, and he was a compact, white-haired man of about 70 who opened his door at their knock with the expression of someone who had learned not to be surprised by what turned up on his step. Eleanor handed him the papers before she introduced herself. He read them standing in the doorway while Pete held the horses, and Eleanor waited with the cold working through her coat. Reed took a long time. He turned pages. He went back to earlier pages. He looked up once, at Eleanor, with an expression she couldn't read, and then went back to the papers. "Where did these come from?" he said. "My husband," Eleanor said. She heard the word in her own mouth, and it did something she hadn't expected. It settled, like a thing finding its right place, like a word that had been approximate becoming exact. "He's been keeping the record for 3 years. Your husband has a better eye for fraud than most lawyers I've met." Reed stepped back from the door. "Come in, both of you. This is going to take a while." She spent 2 days with Reed, answering his questions, helping him trace the pattern in Rowan's documentation, watching him write letters in his precise old man's hand that she understood would travel to people with actual legal authority over what Marsh had been doing. He explained, carefully and without condescension, what the process would look like, and what it would require, and what it was reasonable to expect. He was honest about the fact that it wasn't a certainty. Marsh was a resourceful man, and resourceful men with money had more options in a legal dispute than people without either. But the documentation was strong. If it reached the circuit judge in April, and Reed intended to make sure it did, the probability was good. "Your husband should have brought this forward sooner," Reed said on the second evening. "I know," Eleanor said. "He's learning." Reed looked at her over his coffee cup with the expression of someone who has been around long enough to understand what that sentence contained. "Good man to learn," he said. She and Pete started back on the third morning. The return trip was harder. The weather that had given them a window going south had closed partially behind them, and 2 of the 4 days back were into wind that made the miles longer than they should have been. Pete didn't complain once. Eleanor was aware of being proud of him in the sideways way you feel proud of people who aren't yours to be proud of, and she told him so on the last night, sitting by the fire with the cold pressing in from all sides, and he turned so red she could see it even in the firelight. They came up the ridge route on the afternoon of the 8th day. She smelled the smoke from the Hale chimney before the cabin came into view through the trees, and the specific quality of that relief, familiar smell, known place, particular warmth, was different from what she'd expected. She'd expected to be glad to stop traveling. She hadn't expected to feel, in her chest, something that could only honestly be called coming home. Rowan was at the stable. He heard them coming and came out, and he looked at her in a way that was brief and comprehensive at once, checking that she was whole, cataloging the evidence of 8 days of travel, registering the cold in her face and the tiredness in her posture, and something else that she couldn't name but that she saw him see. "Reed will take it to the judge in April," she said. He nodded. He took the gray's reins without being asked and walked the horse toward the stable, and over his shoulder he said, "There's stew on." Pete said he needed to get home before his mother sent out a search party. Eleanor watched him go down the slope with a feeling of warmth toward him that had nothing to do with the cold, and then she went inside. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it. Fire built, floor swept, the shelf organized in the way she'd organized it. But there was something on the table she didn't recognize, a small object sitting in the center, which turned out, when she crossed to look at it, to be a carved wooden figure, small enough to sit in her palm. A horse, she realized after a moment. The gray gelding, rendered in pine with a level of detail that spoke of many careful hours and a patience she recognized. He'd made it while she was gone. She set it down carefully. She took off her coat. She stood at the window looking down the valley, at the settlement's distant rooftops, at the country that had been trying to close them all in for months, and she felt the particular texture of a decision making itself in her. Not sudden, not dramatic, but cumulative, the way water reaches a level and begins to move. When Rowan came in from the stable, she was still standing at the window. He came in and shut the door against the cold, and she heard him stop, registering her stillness. "Eleanor?" She turned around. He was standing near the door with the cold still coming off him, reading her face with the careful attention he'd always given to things that mattered. "I found the horse," she said. He looked at the table, at the carving. "I had time," he said. "You had time," she repeated. She looked at him. The fire was between them, and the light of it was doing things to the shadows in the room, and she was so tired from 8 days of travel that her defenses were lower than they'd been in years, which was maybe why what came out next came out so cleanly. "I kept thinking about you the whole way there and back. Not the cabin. Not—" She stopped. "You." "I kept thinking about you." He was very still. "I don't know exactly what that means yet," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I do. But I'm telling you because you told me once that you weren't going to hold me to anything I hadn't agreed to myself. And I'm agreeing to something now. I don't know how to say it more plainly than that." Rowan crossed the room. Not fast, not the sweep of some story where people forget themselves. He crossed the room the way he did everything, with the deliberate steadiness of a person who means what they do. He stopped in front of her and put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, and she leaned into it without deciding to, which was its own kind of answer. "I don't know exactly what it means yet either," he said. His voice was low and rough in a way she hadn't heard before. "But I know I haven't been able to stop thinking about the fact that you were going to be gone 8 days and I was counting every one of them." She put her hand over his, the one against her face, and held it there. 7, she said. "We made good time on the way back." She felt him exhale. Not a laugh, but close. The sound of someone releasing something they'd been holding for a while. She was still tired. They were still 2 imperfect people in the middle of a winter that wasn't finished with them yet, with a legal fight ahead that might not go the way they needed, with the whole complicated business of building something real still largely in front of them rather than behind. None of that had changed, but she was standing in the middle of it with his hand against her face and her hand over his, and she was not alone in the way she'd been alone for 9 years, not the way that had lived underneath everything else, like a low, continuous sound she'd stopped being able to hear because it was always there. She could hear the silence where it used to be. Outside, the valley was still buried under February's particular brutality, still working its way through the last and hardest stretch of the season that had been testing all of them since November. The Harmon place needed checking in the morning. The trap lines needed running. There were 4 months of preserved food in the root cellar and 1 window of legal opportunity coming in April, and a settlement full of people who had been surviving on margins thinner than anyone would admit. All of that was true. Also true, the fire was warm. The stew was on. The carved horse sat on the table in the firelight. And Eleanor Hayes, who had arrived here in October with 2 bags and a speech about standards and a wall she'd spent a decade building, was standing with both hands occupied, holding on to something she hadn't expected, in a place that had somehow, without her fully noticing the moment it happened, become hers. February did not go gently. It came down hard in the 3rd week with another system that the valley hadn't seen the equal of in at least a decade, according to Old Miller, who had been reading this particular sky for longer than most of the settlement's current residents had been alive. 3 days of wind that found every gap in every structure and made its presence known. Eleanor spent most of those 3 days doing the kind of interior work that hard weather forces on you, mending, inventory, the slow, careful audit of what they had and what they'd need to get through to the other side of the season. She and Rowan were different with each other after she came back from the southern journey. Not dramatically different. There was no version of either of them that became easy or uncomplicated overnight. But the careful distance they'd been maintaining, the particular courtesy of 2 people who haven't yet decided what they are to each other, had quietly dissolved. They sat closer at the table. They talked longer in the evenings. When she reached past him for something at the stove, he didn't step away. And when he came in cold from the trap line, she had his coffee ready without it being a thing she thought about consciously. Small things. The kind that don't announce themselves and add up anyway. She told him, one evening in the last week of February, that she'd started thinking of the cabin as home sometime around January, and hadn't known how to say it without it meaning more than she was ready for it to mean at the time. He listened to this with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him. When she finished, he said, "I know, I could tell when it happened." She looked at him. How? You stopped looking at the door. She thought about that. She hadn't known she'd been looking at the door, but she believed him. He saw things she didn't see about herself, the way people who watch carefully see things that people who live inside themselves can miss. When did I stop? She asked. He thought about it. Around the time you reorganized the shelf the second time. You did it like it was yours to reorganize. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is mine to reorganize." "I know," he said. "That's the point." March came in with a grudging thaw that didn't fully commit. Warm enough during the days to start the snow moving on the south-facing slopes, cold enough at night to refreeze everything into a treacherous glaze that made the morning walks to the stable genuinely dangerous. Eleanor fell once, caught herself on the rope line, said something her mother would not have approved of, and went on. That was March. You dealt with it. The news about Eli Marsh reached them on a Thursday in the second week of March, carried up by Pete Garner in the particular breathless way he delivered things that he'd been holding on to for the whole 3-mile walk. Callum Reed had been busy. 2 letters had arrived in the settlement, one addressed to the Valley's small but functional community council, which had existed mostly on paper for years and had never been called on to do much beyond settle fence disputes, and one addressed to the county land registry office in the nearest town large enough to have one. Both letters were from Reed, and both referenced the documentation that Eleanor had delivered in January, and both were, in the specific language of people who understood how legal accountability worked, devastating. Reed had not waited for April. He'd written to the circuit judge in February, sending the documentation with a cover letter that laid out the pattern in terms that were, according to Reed's own assessment when Pete had stopped to see him on his way through, difficult to argue with if you were a judge with any interest in the law meaning what it was supposed to mean. Marsh didn't know yet. That was the critical piece. He didn't know the documentation existed or that it had been placed in the hands of people who could do something with it, and the window before he found out was the window in which certain things needed to happen. The council needs to meet, Pete said, still slightly out of breath at the Hale kitchen table with a cup of coffee Eleanor had put in front of him. Before Marsh figures out what's coming, Reed said so in the letter. Eleanor looked at Rowan. He was reading Pete's copy of Reed's letter with the focused stillness of someone absorbing information and cross-referencing it against things they already know. He'll find out when the judge's office contacts him, Rowan said. That gives us 2 weeks, maybe 3. Is that enough time for the council? Eleanor asked. It is if they actually use it. He set down the letter. The problem with the council is that half of them owe something to Marsh directly or indirectly, and the other half are afraid of what happens if they move against him and it doesn't stick. So they need to believe it will stick before they'll move, Eleanor said. Yes. Then they need to see the documentation themselves, not hear about it, see it. Rowan looked at her. Call the meeting, she said. Here if you have to. Bring them up the hill and sit them at this table and show them what you've been building for 3 years. Don't summarize it. Show them. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working against his own nature, the instinct to handle things privately, to manage from the edges, to be the person who made things happen without being seen to make them happen. That's not how I usually work, he said. I know, Eleanor said. Do it anyway. He looked at her for another long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not resistance exactly, but the thing on the other side of resistance. The moment when you acknowledge that someone who knows you well enough has seen accurately. Tuesday, he said. Tell them Tuesday. The council meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon with 7 people crammed into the Hale cabin's main room, which was not built for 7 people, and made no pretense of being comfortable at that capacity. Eleanor knew most of them. Jonas Brandt, whose well had frozen in January and who had every reason to want Marsh accountable. Martha Kinney, who was 68 and had been in this valley longer than anyone alive and whose opinion carried weight proportional to her tenure. Carl Deering, who ran the mill and who had borrowed from Marsh twice and repaid both times, and who Eleanor privately considered the most likely to go either way. 2 others whose relationship to Marsh she was less certain of, and Pete Garner, who was technically too young for the council, but had been included because he was the one who'd carried Reed's letter, and someone had apparently decided that counted for something. Rowan stood at the table with the tin box open and the papers laid out, and he talked for 40 minutes. Eleanor had never heard him talk for 40 consecutive minutes in her life, and she understood what it cost him, not in the sense of pain, but in the sense of expenditure, the way it costs someone who has operated in silence for years to fill a room with their own voice and not stop when the discomfort of it rises. He was not smooth about it. He was not a practiced speaker. He repeated himself twice, got briefly turned around in the chronology of the Harmon documentation, and at one point stopped entirely for nearly 15 seconds in a way that made Carl Deering shift in his seat. But he had the papers, and the papers were specific and dated and cross-referenced in a way that didn't require eloquence. They required only reading, and he put them in front of each person who needed to read them and waited. Martha Kinney read everything. She was the slowest reader and the most thorough. And when she looked up from the last page, she looked at Rowan with an expression that Eleanor recognized as the particular respect of someone who has revised an opinion significantly upward. "You've been sitting on this for 3 years," Martha said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "Until it was enough," Rowan said. "It's enough now, Kint," Martha said, and that was the moment Eleanor knew the meeting had gone the way it needed to go, because when Martha Kinney said something was enough in that tone, people in this valley tended to accept that judgment. Carl Deering pushed back. Not hard. Not in the way of a man defending Marsh, more in the way of a man genuinely afraid of what happened if the move failed. What if the judge didn't act? What if Marsh had his own connections at the county level? What if the documentation wasn't as solid as it looked, and they'd exposed themselves for nothing? Eleanor let him finish. Then she said from her place at the edge of the room where she'd been standing quietly through the whole meeting, "Mr. Deering, what happens if you don't move and the judge doesn't act because no one in the valley was willing to stand behind the documentation?" Deering looked at her. "Marsh keeps going," she said. "The Harmon place goes in spring. The Brandt property goes next winter, probably, once he finds an angle. Your mill—" She paused, letting him hear it. "How long has your deed been clean? All of it? Every document?" Deering's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's not. None of this is fair. But fair isn't what's on the table. What's on the table is whether you're in or you're not." There was a silence. Deering looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Rowan. He looked at Eleanor. She held his gaze without making it into a challenge. Just steady, just present, just the clear and unglamorous fact of what needed to happen. "I'm in," he said. He didn't sound happy about it. That was fine. Happy wasn't required. The council left with copies of the key documents and a plan that would have them formally presenting their testimony to support Reed's submission to the circuit judge. It was not a guarantee. Eleanor understood that. She'd understood it since Reed had told her in January, and she hadn't let herself believe in certainties since she was young enough that belief in certainties was excusable. But it was the best available move, made by people who were finally moving together, and that was as much as you could ask of a situation that had been constructed against you. After they left, the cabin was very quiet. Eleanor started clearing the cups from the table, and Rowan picked up the papers from the tin box and began reordering them. And for a while, the only sounds were those small domestic ones, ceramic on wood, paper on paper, the fire doing what the fire did. "You didn't have to do that," Rowan said. He meant Deering. The moment at the edge of the room. "I know," Eleanor said. "I did it anyway." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that she'd been learning the vocabulary of over 5 months, something that was not a smile and not nothing, some expression that lived in the specific territory between those two things and that she had come to understand was his version of being moved by something. "You're better at this than I am," he said, not with difficulty, just plainly. "At talking, yes," Eleanor said. "You're better at the 3-year patience required to build a case that a talking person can then use. So," he almost smiled. The direction of it was there, anyway. "So," he said. April came the way it always came. Reluctantly at first, then all at once. The snow retreating up the slopes as if embarrassed by its own excess. The valley floor emerging in its annual revelation of mud and dead grass, and the first tentative green underneath both. The creek unfroze and ran high and loud for 2 weeks. The mountain pass opened on the 12th of April, a week earlier than average, which old Miller said meant either an early summer or a late season storm. and that he genuinely could not tell which. The circuit judge arrived on April 19th. His name was Harold Voss, and he was a tall, angular man of about 60, who had the expression of someone who had spent decades listening to people try to lie to him and had become very good at telling when they were doing it. He came into the valley with 2 clerks and a wagon of legal paperwork, and he set himself up in the settlement's meeting hall, a room that usually served as a school during the week, and he worked through the valley's business in the systematic way of a man who had a circuit to complete and a schedule to maintain. Eli Marsh appeared before him on the second day. Eleanor was not in the hall for that. Neither was Rowan. They had submitted their documentation through Reed and the council, and their presence in the room when Marsh faced the consequences would not have added anything useful and might have introduced variables that weren't necessary. They stayed on the hill and waited, and Eleanor worked through the morning on a new kitchen shelf she'd been planning since February and thought about how strange it was that the biggest moments of your life so often happened at a distance, in rooms you weren't in, decided by people you'd only partially influenced. Pete came up in the early afternoon. He was running, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. Voss froze the transactions, Pete said, breathing hard in the cabin doorway. All of them. Every property Marsh claimed notes on. He can't act on any of them pending a full county investigation. Reed's documentation is the basis. Marsh's lawyer tried to argue the records were fabricated, and Voss asked him to explain why a man who'd allegedly fabricated records would have included 3 transactions that showed Marsh in a favorable light, and the lawyer didn't have a good answer for that. Eleanor sat down at the table. "The Harmon place," she said. "Safe. For now, and probably past now." Voss said the pattern was clear enough that he was referring the whole thing to the county prosecutor. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. She was not going to cry. She was too tired for crying and too relieved for it at the same time, which was its own strange state to be in. Rowan was at the window. He'd turned to look out at the valley when Pete had started talking, and he was still looking, and she could see his shoulders and the set of them and the particular stillness of a man absorbing the end of something he'd been carrying for a long time. "What about Marsh himself?" Rowan said. He didn't turn. "He left," Pete said. "Right after the hearing, loaded a wagon and went north. His clerk said he has holdings in the next territory." A pause. "He's not coming back." The room was quiet for a moment. Rowan turned from the window. His face was the face she knew. Controlled, present, not giving more away than he'd decided to give. But his eyes were doing something she'd learned to read as the thing that lived under the control, and what it said, right now, was something close to exhausted relief. The feeling of a weight you've held so long you'd forgotten its name until the moment it was gone, and you felt the absence of it. "Good," he said. One word, quiet, and that was enough. Pete stayed for supper. He was becoming a regular feature of their evenings, which Eleanor had decided she didn't mind. He was good company, and he'd earned a place at their table several times over. He told them, over the meal, that Alfred Harmon had walked to the end of his front path that morning, the first time since December, leaning on a stick but upright. That Agnes had stood at the door watching him and had not said a single word, which Pete described with the confused respect of a 17-year-old who doesn't yet understand why an old woman watching her husband walk to the end of a path might be the most significant thing she'd seen in months. Eleanor understood. She didn't try to explain it. After Pete left, she and Rowan sat by the fire in the particular quiet of an evening that didn't need anything from them. No crisis, no calculation, no management of something fragile. Just the fire and the dark outside and the valley below them finally, slowly, becoming itself again after the long season. "I want to ask you something," Rowan said. Eleanor looked at him. "All right." He turned his cup in his hands, a habit she'd catalogued months ago, the thing he did when he was handling words before he used them. "When the pass opened, when you could leave, you didn't." It wasn't quite a question. She waited to see if there was more. "I'm not asking if you're going to leave," he said. "I know you're not. I mean," he stopped. "I want to know if you want to stay. Not because there's nowhere to go and not because of any arrangement. I want to know if this is what you want." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it had taken for him to say that, Rowan, who showed, rather than told, who had spent years operating in the belief that asking for things was the same as placing a burden on someone. He was asking. He'd learned enough to ask. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay here with you, and I want to figure out whatever comes next, and I want to argue with you when you decide to do dangerous things without telling me first. And I want there to be more evenings like this one." She paused. "Is that clear enough?" "Yes," he said. He said it roughly, like it came from somewhere below his usual register. "That's clear enough." She reached across and took his hand, not briefly this time. She just held it, and he turned it over and held hers back, and they sat like that by the fire while the valley outside moved through the first warm night of its thaw, and Eleanor thought about what 5 months actually contained when you lived them fully. How much can happen in the space between October and April when you stop trying to endure and start actually living where you are? She thought about the girl who had arrived here with 2 bags and a speech about standards and a wall she'd been building for nearly a decade. She didn't miss her exactly, but she held a kind of tenderness toward her, toward the person she'd been before she understood that staying in one place and building something was not the same as being trapped, that the difference between a cage and a home is not the walls but the choice, and that the choice had been hers all along, which was the thing she'd needed to learn and the thing he'd known to give her room to learn. The wedding happened in May. Not elaborate. There was no elaborate available on a frontier that had just survived a devastating winter and was focused primarily on the work of recovery. But it happened in front of the settlement, which mattered, and it happened with Agnes Harmon crying openly in the front and Thomas Hayes standing 3 feet from Eli Marsh's abandoned trading post building, which was already showing the hollow look of a structure no longer maintained by a purpose, and with Alfred Harmon present on his stick at the end of the path he'd walked to in April, watching from a distance because 3 miles was still beyond him, and Pete Garner wearing a collar that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor stood next to Rowan in the May sunlight and was aware of the difference between this and what she'd imagined when she'd heard about the arrangement the previous October. Then, she'd imagined a transaction, a transfer of one kind of obligation into another kind, dressed in ceremony to make it palatable. She'd imagined obligation dressed up as a beginning. This was a beginning. That was the distinction. She knew the difference now between the two things, had learned it over 5 months of living alongside someone who had been showing her the distinction between obligation and choice in every small daily action since the day she arrived. Her father was beside her after, for a few minutes, in the way of 2 people who have reached an understanding that doesn't require being spoken aloud. Thomas Hayes was not a man who had grown suddenly into a different version of himself. He was the same man he'd always been, with the same distances and the same difficulties, but he was also a man who had written a letter and meant it, and who looked at his daughter in the May light with the expression of someone who understood, at last and probably too late, that she had never needed his protection as much as she had needed his respect. "He's a good man," Thomas said. He was looking at Rowan, who was being talked at by Martha Kinney, with the expression of someone enduring something politely. "I know," Eleanor said. "I should have asked you," Thomas said. "Before I made the arrangement, I should have asked you what you wanted." Eleanor looked at her father. She thought about what she'd said to him in October, standing in the kitchen, "The last decision you make for me without asking." He'd heard it. He'd carried it through a winter that he'd spent alone in his house in the settlement, and it had done something to him that was visible in the particular quality of his difficulty in looking at her directly. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She paused. "I'm glad it happened the way it did. That's not the same as saying it was right." He nodded. He understood the difference. She believed that. She went back to her husband. That word again, exact now in the way it had become exact in February. Not approximate, not a category she'd been assigned to, but a true description of a specific and chosen thing. The summer was work. It was always work on the frontier. And this summer was more work than usual because the winter had done what bad winters do and left a long list of repairs and replacements and catch-up tasks that the warmer months had to absorb. Rowan expanded the stable to hold a second horse, Eleanor's suggestion, and he'd seen the logic of it immediately. She started a proper kitchen garden on the south slope, something neither of them had managed before because neither had been here long enough in the previous springs to establish one. The work of it was absorbing and physical and satisfying in the particular way that creating something from ground up is satisfying when you expect to be there long enough to use what you've made. They argued in July about the root cellar expansion he wanted to undertake, because Eleanor thought his timeline was optimistic, given the other projects already running, and Rowan thought her assessment of the timeline was conservative, in a way that was going to leave them with the same inadequate storage the following winter. They were both partially right, and neither was fully right, and the argument went 3 rounds over 4 days before they arrived at a compromise that was better than either of their original positions, which Eleanor suspected was how most things between them were going to go, and she found she didn't mind. He still went quiet sometimes for longer than was comfortable. She still reached for self-sufficiency as a first response when she should have asked for help. These were not problems they'd solved. They were tendencies they'd learned to recognize in each other and navigate around, imperfectly, with varying degrees of grace depending on what the day had already required of them. That was what it looked like. Not smooth, not a story where two people's sharp edges somehow stopped being sharp because they'd found the right person. The sharp edges were still there. They just learned where the other persons were and how to move without cutting, most of the time. August arrived, and with it a particular evening that Eleanor thought about for a long time afterward, because it was the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as significant and turns out to be. She was sitting on the step outside the cabin door in the last of the day's light, which in August lasted longer than you expected and was worth sitting in. The valley below was green in the way it only got in the fullest part of summer, a deep, dense green that made the winter seem like something that had happened to a different place. The settlement's rooftops were visible through the trees, smoke from the Harmon chimney, the distant sound of the creek still running from the season's good snowpack. Rowan came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. They sat in the light together and watched the valley do what the valley did in August, which was simply to be what it was, and Eleanor thought, this is what I was afraid of missing. Not the drama of the winter, not the crisis and the fear and the things that were tested, those she could have lived without, but this, the ordinary specific weight of a day that ends in a place you belong, with a person you've earned and who has earned you. She thought about who she'd been in October, the woman who had stood in the mud watching her father's wagon disappear and had promised herself she would not be destroyed by this. She hadn't been destroyed. She'd been built into something she hadn't known was possible before she'd started. That wasn't a comfortable thought, exactly. She didn't like the idea that the arrangement, her father's bad decision, the debt, the whole constructed situation she'd had no say in, had led her here because it gave too much credit to a process that had been wrong regardless of where it ended. Good outcomes don't retroactively justify bad decisions. She believed that. She held on to it. But she also held on to this, the step, the light. Rowan's shoulder against hers, the valley below. I've been thinking, Rowan said. About what? He was quiet for a moment, the cup-turning pause without the cup. About what I want the next 10 years to look like. Eleanor looked at him sideways. And? And this, he said, more or less exactly this. She looked back at the valley. She thought about 10 years of this. The work and the winters and the arguments and the evenings and everything that would happen in that space that she couldn't predict and wouldn't want to, because the unpredictable was where everything real had come from. More or less, she said. There'll be things we don't expect, he said. There always are. We'll manage them. She thought about that. Not as a promise. She was too practical for promises about things neither of them could see yet, but as a statement of what had already been proven. They had managed the winter. They had managed Marsh and the Harmon crisis, and the legal fight, and 8 days of separation, and every argument, and every silence, and every hard morning when the cold came through the wall, and the list of tasks was longer than the day had hours. They had managed it, not perfectly, not without cost, but together, and that was the operative word, together in the specific sense of two people who had each remained themselves while becoming something new, who hadn't dissolved into each other or given up their edges, but had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to face the same direction. Yes, Eleanor said, we will. The light finished its work and left them in the blue early dark. She didn't go in yet. Neither did he. They sat on the step in the cooling August evening while the valley went quiet around them, and the stars came out above the ridgeline one at a time in the way they always did, and the little cabin behind them held its warmth against the night, the way it had been built to do, solidly, without drama, for exactly this.